Hey, what's up? It's Phoenix, and today I'm very excited because I'm going to read an essay that I wrote recently, and I'm very excited to share it. It is called, "Was Plato Authoritarian?" and it is inspired by the writings of Karl Popper. So without further ado, let's dive right in. Was Plato authoritarian? I am not sure what to make of the writings of Karl Popper about politics, including his book and magnum opus, The Open Society and Its Enemies. On the one hand, I find the book to be philosophically coherent, thoughtful, and erudite. It focuses on certain concepts in the history of philosophy in order to argue for a free and open society, a free and open democracy. However, I am not sure that Popper's critique of Plato is accurate, at least completely. While I don't need to defend Plato, and can definitely recognize that even the greatest philosopher in history has flaws and faults that should definitely be critiqued and criticized, I think that Karl Popper is exaggerating his points a little bit too much in order to make his case. Literally, what it comes down to is Karl Popper thinks that Plato was an authoritarian thinker and was authoritarian in his politics. It is true that this is a very sensationally argued criticism of Plato, and there's probably some degree of truth to it, because there is a grain of truth in probably any criticism. For one thing, we know that ancient Greek philosophers privileged their position as being superior culturally because they were the ones who were doing the real work. At least, this is often how I've heard it described by critics. It was only the leisure class that could write philosophy at this time, and this is a good point to keep in mind. Philosophers like Plato and Aristotle were definitely in a culturally privileged position, and that obviously influenced their ideas and worldview. I certainly don't want to defend Plato, at least dramatically, and that is because I definitely think that Plato has some flaws. However, I do struggle with the political argument that Plato is authoritarian in his politics. This to me seems too black and white. Maybe from a historical perspective there is some truth to this. However, it seems to me that Plato also presented really important arguments for human freedom, and so in my mind, it depends on how we read Plato, that also gives us our interpretation. In other words, we can criticize any philosopher for bringing about problematic politics, but that doesn't mean that our reading of it is correct. While a lot of people don't like Nietzsche because they don't like his ethics, I wouldn't blame Nietzsche solely for the atrocities of World War II. I would argue that Nietzsche probably contributed to some of the chaos by way of his ideas in politics, but it is far from only his responsibility, since Nietzsche is still just a philosopher, not someone who was going to kickstart a major world war through his power. If anything, Nietzsche was very quiet and insignificant. It seems to me that social violence comes from many places, not just the philosophers. I make these arguments, and I recognize that they are not always convincing. Obviously, we need to be responsible and ethical with the ideas that we present to the world, and we need to make sure that we are doing so with a clear conscience and with conscientiousness. However, blaming philosophers doesn't seem helpful because it doesn't clarify the ideas, it doesn't explain how things unfolded. It doesn't show us what we can believe alternatively, it just makes us afraid to think, afraid to postulate ideas. So then, where do I land on this? Was Plato an authoritarian philosopher? Should we reject his thinking as destructive to societies and totalitarian? I think in some ways we could definitely argue that this is true. Plato had an agenda because he was very exclusive with who he allowed into his academy, and he thought only certain people, the philosophers or philosopher king, should rule. I haven't read all of Plato's works, but I've read enough to recognize that he does think heavily about politics, and while this is difficult territory to be in, it seems to me that sometimes Plato privileges certain viewpoints over others. However, I might just be too charitable here, but give me a moment to explain. They also did a lot of things that I think were very important for the history of thought and how we look at politics today in the first place. First off, I think of Socrates. Socrates was not authoritarian in my mind. Socrates was all about free inquiry, getting at the truth, having conversations, and at times corrupting the youth. Just kidding. We could probably write an entire book on just Socrates, but suffice to say that the important point here is that Socrates was definitely a very specific character, and his viewpoint influenced Plato throughout his entire writing career. Second, Plato was very concerned with notions of justice. While Karl Popper sees Plato's notions of justice as manipulative and muddy, I think that the question of what is justice is a very difficult but important question to try to answer. In my charitable and humble reading of Plato, I'm kidding, I have not seen Plato as being disingenuous with how he talks about his idea of what justice should be. Thirdly, Plato allowed various perspectives in his dialogues. Not only was it Plato's perspective, sometimes through the perspective of Socrates, but Socrates is always talking with a variety of thinkers and intellectuals and people throughout the ancient world, and this cannot be taken for granted or overlooked. This is, in my mind, how free inquiry works. You ask questions, you try to come to a conclusion through discussion, and you talk to other people. This seems to be a very tolerant way of approaching the world and others, the opposite of authoritarianism, and I don't know why Karl Popper doesn't recognize this as evidence that Plato himself was willing to entertain a variety of perspectives, even if Plato, like anyone, still had his own opinions. It is true that Karl Popper is probably being polemical then, and there is probably some truth that he is also being sensational in his approach. I have also stated that I don't need to defend Plato because I can take it or leave it, as they say, and I don't have strong feelings about Plato in general, even though he has influenced my thought. But it is very difficult for me to see Plato as authoritarian because of the things that Plato argues for in his writings. He is trying to understand the best system of government, and he is thinking hard about the many things that have happened in the ancient world, including the execution of Socrates and how unfair that was in the first place. I don't think a suspicion of democracy means that you are totalitarian in your viewpoint. Popper literally argues that Plato not liking democracy makes him authoritarian. Maybe Plato does have some tendency to control the narrative and the dialogue, but that will happen with any thinker because no one can be completely objective. It seems to me that we are always biased and we don't always think in clear ways, but we should certainly try to. This is another point that Karl Popper brings up, which is Plato's forms. According to Popper, the notion of the forms is incredibly authoritarian, and that is because Plato seems to be arguing that there is an ultimate form of justice and other virtues, that the forms are the ultimate form, and that the fixedness of the forms of our institutions or ideas are unchangeable, and thus authoritarian in their roots. Maybe my reading of Plato has been more loosely interpreted, but I always saw the forms as a fascinating representation of the ideal, which often puzzles and plagues philosophers. What is the perfect world or idea? In my mind, the notion of Plato's forms is important to understanding the ideal. So in my mind, the forms are not authoritarian, they are simply a representation of the best things, a metaphor for something better. It is not that there is only one way to form justice. There are many ways, and there are many ways of viewing it. I don't want to let Plato off the hook, of course, and it is true that Plato is definitely flawed, but in my mind, our idea of inquiring freely into the nature of the universe and society is incredibly important, and it partially comes, at least in the Western tradition, from Plato. To be able to ask questions is incredibly important, to be able to write books is incredibly valuable, and to try to tell the story of Western society by way of philosophical rigor is an incredible and interesting idea. So in my mind, Plato is just thinking about the world through a variety of other viewpoints, and he is trying to understand what is true in the best way and how we should organize society. Where then does Karl Popper's concern stem from? Why is he so critical, seeing Plato as a slippery slope? This is a good question, and it is not easy to answer. In my mind, Karl Popper is trying to get at the root of where authoritarian thinking comes from. Karl Popper is trying to understand what is going on in his own present day, where World War II is literally about to break out. In that way, this is a very important book. We should be critical of philosophers, we shouldn't just coddle them and coddle tradition. As much as I may like Nietzsche's writing, Nietzsche himself was flawed, and so was Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, Hegel, Marx. They are flawed in their thinking, and they should be critiqued in good faith and good conscience. However, we should also be open to different points of view. This does get difficult when thinking about what we should tolerate and not allowing horrible thought processes to squeeze through. But it seems to me that no system of thought is perfect, and anything that anyone says or writes down is going to be incredibly flawed. My biggest criticism, then, of Karl Popper and his book is I think that he commits the slippery slope fallacy as well as makes a lot of strawman arguments, and because of that, I don't think he has an accurate view of where totalitarian thinking comes from. It is fair to say that I probably am coming from a certain place of luxury because the world is not about to break out into a violent world war, and also I am in a place and in a country where I can think, where I can ask questions, where I can write my books, and I am not censored, blockaded, or killed. So in that way, I'm coming from a place that is protected by the rights of my country and by the rights that I have as a citizen of the world and of America. But I think that Karl Popper gets it wrong, at least he has so far in my reading of his book. I don't want to, in turn, be too critical of Karl Popper because I want to be charitable in my reading. But at least as far as what philosophy is supposed to bring, I feel it gives us a new viewpoint, and that is important. In my mind, there is a place for philosophy, and I feel partially indebted to Plato for encouraging me to think independently and to try to understand the nature of the world through the Socratic method and through philosophical inquiry in general. Karl Popper is just arguing for what he thinks makes the most sense, and that is exactly the place for philosophizing and thinking. There are serious questions that Popper and Plato are wrestling with, and there is no easy answer. Certainly it is something to think about and to take seriously, and while I don't have the answer or the solution, I find it to be important to explore, and that is why I ask the question.